More than 1,300 people were killed when an earthquake struck central Turkey and northwest Syria, in one of the most powerful quakes in the region in at least a century, while a second powerful shake hours later threatened to overwhelm rescue efforts. Thousands more were injured as the quake wiped out entire sections of major cities in a region filled with millions of people who have fled the civil war in Syria. The magnitude 7.8 quake, which hit in the early darkness of a winter morning, was followed by a second 7.7 quake in the middle of the day on Monday. As rescuers in both countries were still attempting to search for survivors, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said 912 people were killed, 5,383 injured, and 2,880 buildings had collapsed. In Syria, already racked by more than 11 years of civil war, the health ministry said more than 326 people had been killed and 1,042 injured. In the Syrian rebel held northwest, rescuers said 147 people had died. The toll was expected to rise as rescue workers and residents searched frantically for survivors under the rubble of crushed buildings in cities on both sides of the border. The images shocked people in Turkey, standing in the snow in their pajamas, watching rescuers dig through the debris of damaged homes. Buildings were leveled while many people were still asleep. Tremors were felt as far away as Lebanon, Greece, Israel, and the island of Cyprus. In the southern Turkish town of Gaziantep, 150 miles from the border with Syria and 50 miles from the epicenter of the earthquake in Kahramanmaraş, residents felt aftershocks hours later. We woke up with a jolt as the electricity was off. We laid still and waited for the shaking to finish. Our house was full of broken glass, said one tradesperson in Gaziantep. We used our phone's flashlight so we could get dressed and hurried out of the house. Anyone able to save themselves now has fled somewhere. I have relatives in Kahramanmaraş. Their houses were destroyed. Images from Gaziantep appear to show that the earthquake caused the collapse of the city's historic castle, an ancient and imposing stone structure atop a hill used as an observation point during Roman times. The head of the Turkish Red Crescent, the biggest humanitarian organization in Turkey and part of the International Red Cross, said it was mobilizing rescuers for the region and urged people to evacuate damaged homes. The head of Turkey's disaster management agency said all capabilities of our state were mobilized after the quake, warning civilians to keep communication to urgent texts only to help emergency services find survivors. Images on Turkish television showed rescuers digging through the rubble of leveled buildings in the city of Kahramanmaraş and neighboring Gaziantep, where entire high-rise blocks were destroyed. A fire lit up the night sky in one image from Kahramanmaraş, although its origin remained unclear. Buildings also crumbled in the cities of Adiyaman, Malatya, and Diyarbakir, where people rushed out on the street in panic. Residents in the town of Fazarsik said they feared for those trapped under fallen buildings. One resident said the powerful shocks from the earthquake shook his family. Our house looks solid from the outside, but there are cracks inside. There are destroyed buildings around me. There are houses on fire. There are buildings that are cracking. A building collapsed just 200 miles away from where I was. He said, "We are waiting for the sun to rise so that we can see the scale of the earthquake." People are outside in all fear. The Turkish President Erdogan, who will be under pressure to oversee an effective response to the disaster heading to an election on 14 May, said search and rescue teams had been dispatched to the affected areas. We do not know how high the number of dead and injured will go. Our hope is to get through this disaster with the least loss, he said in a speech. This is the biggest disaster we have experienced in the last century after the 1939 Erzincan earthquake, he said, citing an incident over 32,000 people were killed in eastern Turkey in 1939. Even before the tragedy, buildings in Aleppo, Syria's commercial hub, often collapsed due to dilapidated infrastructure after more than a decade of war, as well as little oversight to ensure safety of new construction projects, some built illegally. The Syrian Civil Defense Rescue Service, known as the White Helmets, that works to save those trapped under debris from airstrike, said it had declared a state of emergency to rescue the many people feared trapped under collapsed buildings in areas around Idlib and across opposition-held areas in northwestern Syria. In a statement, the organization described a catastrophic situation with buildings collapsed or suffering major cracks, hundreds injured and stranded, dozens dead, and lack of services, as well as safe shelters and assembly points in stormy and snowy weather conditions and low temperatures. The group also added a plea for aid from the international community to prevent the situation from worsening and to pressure both the Syrian government and their backers in Moscow to hold back on airstrikes in the area to prevent further tragedy. People in Damascus, as well as in the Lebanese cities of Beirut and Tripoli, ran into the street on foot and took to their cars to get away from their buildings in case of collapse, witnesses said. Painting fell off the walls in the house, said a resident of Damascus. I woke up terrified. Now we are all dressed and standing at the door. 8 groups fear the disaster will worsen the situation for Syrians already displaced after a decade of civil war. This is a disaster that will worsen the suffering of Syrians already struggling with a severe humanitarian crisis, said a refugee of this area. He also added, millions have already been forced to flee by the war in the wider region, and now many more will be displaced by this disaster. In the midst of a winter storm and an unprecedented cost of living crisis, it is vital that Syrians are not left to face the aftermath on their own. Turkey is in one of the world's most active earthquake zones, with land stretching over the Anatolian fault line in the north of the country that has caused large and destructive tremors. Izmir and the surrounding Kocaeli region close to the Istanbul was rocked by a 7.4 magnitude earthquake in 1999, the worst to hit Turkey in decades. The quake killed more than 17,000 people, including at least 1,000 in Istanbul, aimed whispered destruction. Experts have long warned a large quake could devastate Istanbul. Nasi Gorer, an earthquake expert with Turkey's Academy of Science, urged local officials to immediately check the region's dams for cracks to avoid potentially catastrophic flooding.